Okay, at this time we're going to have our second message for the day from Mr. Curtis Whiteley, entitled Leaving Egypt, the Unleavened Life.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the seventh day of the Festival of Unleavened Bread. I hope that it's wonderful to see everyone here, as it always is, on this seventh day, and I hope everybody has had a rich and meaningful Festival of Unleavened Bread. Many of us have kept this feast for many, many years, some more than others, obviously. But we've heard countless messages on what this festival is all about. Being at the very end, we've already heard some of those messages just recently. I apologize. Let me get set up here. I have a certain way I like to... Okay. Being obviously in this season, we have certain things that passages that we read. Every year we have a very, I guess you would say, repeatable experience at Pentecost. We often kind of do the same things. We obviously do the foot washing, the symbols of the bread and the wine, a similar format. And we rehearse this festival and obviously keep it for 7 days. And it's distinct Passover, Days of Unleavened Bread, but they go together and they have significant meaning together. And so as I was preparing this message, and I've mentioned this on other holy days, it's tough when you try to think of, what's fresh? What have we not heard before? What is it? What's something new? And as I was preparing this message, I just realized that that's kind of the opposite of the point of this day. It's not about looking at something new. It's about rehearsing the old. It's about yearly, year in, year out, rehearsing and proclaiming the stories of God moving in time and space on this earth with people, with individuals that He's called out. As was mentioned, the title of my message today is Leaving Egypt, the Unleavened Life. And to start out today, Steve on Sabbath kind of traced the Exodus story to some extent. And I want to go back to the very beginning of the Exodus story. Before the actual events took place per se, before all of the things that happened between Moses and Pharaoh. And I want to go back and look at what got them in that predicament. You know, living in this modern Judeo-Christian society that we live in, the Exodus story is kind of common. It's understood. It may be fading a little bit as our biblical literacy is kind of waning. But we see in our English language, in our culture, in movies, and film, and novels, there's language and allusions to this famous story in the book of Exodus. When I was in college, I remember writing a paper on the Exodus, and in particular, how Martin Luther King Jr. used the Exodus story in the Civil Rights Movement. Kind of a reader response, as they would call it, as they were going through what they were going through and trying to proclaim liberty in the days of segregation and things like that. And many of you may have experienced those days. That movement used the Exodus story as inspiration. But in the Exodus, the first chapter, we are introduced to the beginning scene that sets up the Exodus story and what had taken place since we had left off in the book of Genesis. And if you remember from your Bible reading, the family of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, specifically the sons of Jacob and his family, go down to Egypt at the very end of the book of Genesis. But when we pick it up in the book of Exodus, we see that there's a review of all the different sons of Jacob that came down to Egypt. The Genesis and then the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, refers to 70 individuals that initially went down. You go to Acts, and you go to some other places that says 75, which just means that they reckoned the number a little bit differently. But when we open up the book of Exodus, it's different than what we left off in Genesis. A new problem had emerged because now the leader, even though Joseph was a leader in the book of Genesis, many years have passed by. And a new king, known as a Pharaoh, rose up in Egypt that did not know Joseph and was becoming anxious about the growing numbers of Israelites in Egypt. And so he decides, because he thinks that this is a national threat, to put them under what's known in the Hebrew as a Sarei Masim, taskmasters. And the mission of these taskmasters was to inflict intense forced labor, slavery as we know it, upon the backs of the Israelites in the hopes of reducing their population to a more manageable number. And so we see this time passes by and they are now in a new predicament. We read in Exodus, the first chapter, verses 11 through 14. It says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses." In verse 12 it says, "But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick, in all manner of service in the field. And all their service in which they made them serve was with rigor." However, this did not achieve the objective of Pharaoh. This did not achieve the ends that he wanted, so he decided to take measures into his own hands 2 different times. First, he tries to convince the midwives of Egypt to kill any male that is born among the Hebrew women. That doesn't work, so he decides to take it upon himself for the Egyptians to directly go throughout Egypt. And Exodus, the first chapter, verse 22, says, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." And so we have a partial genocide, so to speak, going on. Now we've read these stories, and they can kind of become cliche, and we live in the United States of America, and in our modern context, with all of the freedoms that we have, it is, and I will admit, difficult to fathom those kind of circumstances. But we do live in a world where many people still live to this day, where one of the most horrific genocides that humanity has ever seen took place less than 100 years ago. 6 million Jews, of course, in Central Europe in the Holocaust, being exterminated. So even though this seems so far off and so foreign to us, we have recent historical events that can kind of give us a glimpse of the evilness that can exist within the hearts of human beings. In our current day, I looked it up, and there's current genocides. They might not be to the level that we see in the Holocaust, but there are places in Africa, places in Asia, where there are actual people groups that are sought out to be exterminated, oftentimes in the name of religion or in the name of national security. Well, we know what happens in the Exodus story. Eventually, God raises up a man among the Egyptians who himself was an Israelite from the tribe of Levi, known as Moses. And in the process of time, and after a series of events that actually led him out of Egypt, God decided to call upon Moses in Exodus, the 3rd chapter. In verse 7, this is what we read. This is the famous, of course, burning bush story. In verse 7 it says, "And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites, and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And of course, we know that this is connected to God's faithfulness. Because we know that this story is actually a story of a family. It's a story about when Genesis, the 12th chapter, we find that God begins to work with a specific individual by the name of Abraham. And He gives him this promise, this covenant. And that covenant is drawn down through his son and his grandson and to their descendants. And this is the story of God being faithful to that covenant. Moses was given a declaration by God that he was going to come down to visit the Israelites and to give them refuge out of slavery and the oppression that had come upon them. He did not forget them. Literally, God is saving Israel in this story from death. I know it's slavery, but the intentions of the Egyptians was to bring death upon the Israelites. And God is paving a way for these Israelites to have a life with abundance. But it would only come through a process. We know that the Egyptians did not release the Israelites simply, but through a series of 9 plagues that were enacted against Pharaoh and the Egyptians. The time comes when God would enact the very plague that He attempted to enact on the firstborn of Egypt. All of those things that Pharaoh did to the Israelites now is going to come upon the heads of the Egyptians. He's going to visit them with their own iniquity in the similitude of what He dished out to the Israelites. The 10th plague is going to be the death of the firstborn of all the Egyptians, and really anyone who lived in Israel, unless they did what God had commanded them. We kind of reviewed the story. We know this story is connected to what we did just Tuesday night and these last 7 days. But Israel's given this command to go and find a lamb that was of 1 year of age, that was without blemish, on the 10th day, and to take care of this land for 4 days. And on the 14th day, to slaughter it at twilight or evening. Ben ha-arbaim is the Hebrew word, and it has a lot of controversy and a lot of different interpretations, but essentially it means between the 2 evenings. And when they do that, they were to take the blood of that lamb, wipe it on the door frames on each side and over the top. In Exodus, the 12th chapter, we're given this command. It says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." Passover. What a simple title for this appointed time that God has enacted in human history. It's a memorial of Him passing over the Israelites, and then, of course, the ultimate fulfillment, passing over us, believers in Christ, which we will get to here in just a bit. But obviously, even though Pharaoh refused to allow the children of Israel go, this time he listens. God brings him to his knees, and he listens, at least for a time, not completely, And we see that after this event happens, the Egyptians could not drive out the Israelites fast enough. Exodus, the 12th chapter, verse 31 through 34, and verse 39. We're going to read it real quick. It says, "Then he called for Moses and Aaron," that is Pharaoh, by night, "and said, 'Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also.' And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste. For they said, 'We shall all be dead.'" They wanted them out of there. They finally listened. Verse 34, "So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up and their clothes on their shoulders." And going down to verse 39, it says, "And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of the land of Egypt. For it was not leavened because they were driven out of Egypt. It could not wait, nor had they prepared provision for themselves." Thus is the first example in the Bible of why during this time of year we walk around eating this stuff. And we're going to get to the meaning of this here in just a little while. Ever pull this out of your lunch pail at work? Get some eyebrows rolled? This, flat, somewhat tasteless, but tastes good kind of at the same time. It's strange. The funny thing is that despite, as I mentioned, in the Judeo-Christian Western world that we live in, the Exodus being something that we're familiar with, or our society in general is familiar with, unleavened bread, not so much. People kind of stop at the story of the Red Sea and things like that. They come out, the plagues, that's exciting. This isn't exciting. But the Bible has something it called, the first time it mentions it calls it unleavened bread, but in Deuteronomy, when there's kind of a review of all of the holy days in Deuteronomy, specifically for the Passover, Deuteronomy 16, it calls this not the unleavened bread, but the bread of affliction. Verse 3 of Deuteronomy 16, "You shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it. That is the bread of affliction. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that you may remember the day in which you came out of the land of Egypt, all the days of your life." It was a memorial. It was an unfortunate memento for the Israelites to remember just what God had brought them out of. The oppressive circumstances of living under the Sarei Masim, the Egyptian taskmasters. But there was a problem. And that is, when we read this story, for a lot of these Israelites, despite them leaving, Egypt still lingered in their hearts. Almost immediately after God brought Israel out of Egypt through the Red Sea on dry land, actually during, we're going to see that in a minute, and after seeing the miracles by God with their own eyes, Israel still longed for Egypt. When Stephen, the New Testament character Stephen in the book of Acts, was giving his defense of Jesus Christ for why he was the one that Jesus spoke about, the Messiah, he says this in Acts, the 7th chapter, verse 38 through 39, breaking into context. He says, "This is he," talking about Jesus, "who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give to us, whom our fathers would not obey, but rejected, and in their hearts they turned back to Egypt." In their hearts, they turned back to Egypt. So for a lot of these Israelites, it shows that it's possible, as was demonstrated, and as we're going to read a few passages in a minute, that one can be outwardly delivered, but still be continually, internally enslaved. How forgetful And there's so many examples of this. And really, when you read the Exodus story, it is the story of the Bible. And what I mean is it happens over and over and over again. Many exoduses. You have the main exodus. They go into the promised land eventually. And the first thing that happens is that they run into trouble again. They enslave themselves because they rebel against God. God raises up a Moses-like judge to deliver them. They get delivered, freedom again from their enemies, and then that cycle repeats itself. Until eventually, the Egypt that rises up is actually among their own leaders. And so, the interesting thing about this story, right after they come out of Egypt, or during the midst of them, in Exodus, the 14th chapter, verses 11 through 12, they look back and they see Pharaoh's army coming. They know about all the plagues that happened in Egypt. They know about all the things that God had done upon the Egyptians and protected them from. They saw the death of the firstborn. But in Exodus, the 14th chapter, in the midst of crossing the Red Sea, they said to Moses this. Then they said to Moses, verse 11 of Exodus 14, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. What a sarcastic statement. Is it because there's no graves out here, Moses? Is that why you brought us out to this wilderness? And all of us, every time I read it, you can't help but shake your head. But as I've grown older, and maybe my age is getting to me, I feel like I've become a little less judgmental of these original Israelites. And maybe that's because in my experience as a human being, I know just how easy it is for me, myself, to stumble. And in my heart, think some of the same things that these Israelites thought. Now, we have the benefit of being a post-Pentecost, so to speak, Christian or church, Holy Spirit, the indwellment. We have the benefit of seeing the story all at once. We're not experiencing these specific circumstances, but I do think it's easy for sometimes for us to just think, well, man, those sinful Israelites, those stiff-necked people, and forget that sometimes we, living in the flesh as well, can fall trap to having Egypt within our hearts. Another example, and there's many, in Exodus, the 16th chapter, verses 1 through 3. This is them longing for comfort. They're frustrated because they don't have the same sustenance in their minds that they had when they were in Egypt, even though they were enslaved. Verse 1 of Exodus, the 16th chapter says, and they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they departed from the land of Egypt. This is just 1 month after the Exodus. Verse 2, then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. And we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out of the land, or out into this wilderness, to kill this whole assembly with hunger. And there's many other examples of the Israelites doing the same thing to Moses, to going back in their minds to longing for Egypt once again. Even right before they go into the promised land for the first time when they were supposed to, and they said that, no, we can't go. They wanted to oust Moses, Numbers the 14th chapter, if you want to read that, and erect a new leader that would take them back to Egypt. So years and years and years go by, and the sad story of Israel happens. They eventually become a kingdom and then a divided kingdom. And they eventually, both of those kingdoms go into captivity. But after the Babylonian captivity and the Persians rise up and the Israelites come back, the Jews during this time as they eventually will become referred to, because it's the southern kingdom of Judah. They return from Babylon to Jerusalem, and they rebuild a temple. And there's a story in Nehemiah about how they rebuild this temple, and eventually in Nehemiah, the 9th chapter, there's this, the 8th chapter, there's this revival of reading of the law and remembering what God had done, remembering the covenant. And this is what the Levites said. This is the Levites that are reflecting on Israel's history in Nehemiah, the 9th chapter, verses 16 through 17, just breaking into context. But they, talking about their fathers, but they and our fathers acted proudly, hardened their necks, and did not heed your commandments. They refused to obey, and they were not mindful of your wonders that you did among them. But they hardened their necks, and in their rebellion they appointed a leader to return to their bondage. But you are a God ready to pardon, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abundant in kindness. It did not forsake them. Never let anyone tell you that the grace of God does not exist in the Old Testament, because it clearly does. But we must ask ourselves again, in times of stress, in times of discomfort, do we turn to God, or do we fold like the Israelites? Do we long for Egypt in our hearts, in our subconsciousness? The meaning, as I've mentioned several times before, the meaning of the Exodus story is familiar in our culture today, and I mentioned about how this is much less more familiar to people. However, the interesting thing is that it's not something that's just talked about, of course, in the Old Testament. But it has quite a bit to say, or a few key passages, we're going to look at that, about what it has to say in the New Testament. Now, if you were to read the story of the Exodus, and you just learned that passage in Exodus, the 12th chapter, that, well, they just didn't have enough time to let their dough rise and things like that, and it just becomes this like random, coincidental, circumstantial coincidence why unleavened bread is the symbol of this feast. But when we turn to the New Testament, we see that there's a new way that leavening becomes interpreted, a more fuller way, a more fuller meaning. Now, we know that a lot of time has passed on. Since the original Passover that had taken place, once we get to the times of Jesus and things like that. But when we open up the New Testament, we see that Israel, primarily now referred to as the Jews by the Romans and people around them, as well as Jesus himself, understood leavening with a new meaning. They understood that it wasn't just about dough that wasn't able to rise, but there was something hidden in that circumstance that happened thousands of years before. When Jesus, for example, Mark the 8th chapter, verse 15, you can read that, and we might put it up there real quick. But when Jesus, for example, was instructing his disciples, he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herod. You can also see that in Matthew the 16th chapter. But in this case, Jesus was talking about the influence of both the religious leaders and Herod. Their influence is spread to dominate how the Jews of the time, they were the ones who dominated the thinking, thus dominated how the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament was interpreted. Now, there's a modern example I want to give you, and most of you probably knew this for years and years and years, but I did not. And it's this illustration that I just was thinking about recently as I was preparing this message, and it's the modern day culinary trend known as the sourdough making craze. And maybe you joined in on it. My wife did. But a few years ago, and I looked this up, like what made this craze such a big deal? But I guess during COVID, I know, bad memories, lockdowns, everything slowed down. People are two things. They're stuck at home, but also grocery stores start having shortages of things, and one of those shortages was yeast. You can buy yeast, pre-made and all that, and I don't know how all that works. And if you're a sourdough expert, please forgive me if I get some of this wrong, but I think the gist of it I'm going to get right. But this trend became really popular on social media, people sharing recipes, strategies. My wife got into it. It was all the rage among her and her work friends. Bought a whole kit and everything. But the chemistry of this, as I was kind of thinking about it, is why I wanted to bring this out. And it's really nothing new. It's just new for ignorant Curtis Whiteley here that really never knew about how bread making worked. But essentially, in sourdough making, and I'm sure other types of dough and things like that's the same way, the process works, you start with this thing called the starter, right? And so it's a mixture of flour and water, and it's stored in a warm temperature for about 7 to 14 days. And at this point, as the days go by, the leavening reaction occurs. Something that I learned is called spontaneous fermentation. And this becomes the basis of how it will make the dough rise that you mix into your dough. So the interesting part is the starter, it's used over and over and over again. I used to think, why do you keep, that's just old stuff in the cabinet? Like, that's what you're going to put that in the food or the bread you're going to make? I remember this, and now that I'm learning it, I'm like, this all makes sense now. But you take that starter and you make it, and eventually once you make it, you just keep feeding it. And you have this starter, this yeast-based starter that you just add a little bit of your dough as you make your oven. Some people keep this stuff for months and months and sometimes years, and they just keep feeding it. So the starter becomes the basis of this dough making that will eventually rise. And it's interesting because it's really the exact same way. I mean, we still live on the same earth. It's the same way that leavening took place in the Bible. 2 ways. Number 1, 2 main ways at least. You could mix flour and water and let it stand until it began to ferment naturally, which is the longer method. But the more common way was to use an already leavened starter of dough that was left over from previous cooking, or maybe the days before or the week before. And this method is almost the identical of the whole concept of sourdough making, proving there is absolutely, like the Bible says, nothing new under the sun. It's literally just a new craze that's repackaged, even though we've had it for 6 millennia or however long it's been. But the reason I wanted to bring this up was not to describe the process of leavening. We understand leavening puffs up, it rises, and it has all different meanings that we can bring out. But the process of how it passes from the old to the new. And how people in this culture, in the Bible, even in the Old Testament, and in Jesus' day, despite being a new loaf of bread, it had the same DNA of the old. And a long-standing relationship with the old as the old is continuing to live through the new. So that starter is just continuing a line of life. The old is in the new. And then the new becomes old and it goes into the new. And I think that this is an interesting example, and I think it helps to be very informative to how Paul describes 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, which we've already read a few times during this season, but we're going to go there. But in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church, and we've read this so many different times, and it has relevance to us during this time of year because he specifically mentions Passover and leavening and unleavening and leavened bread and things like that. But he's dealing with a particular situation, contextually, with this group of believers. And he's talking to them in frustration because of their toleration of some sort of sin that seems to be the result of some sort of inappropriate relationship that was going on among this congregation. And so obviously it was during the day, not during the days of leavened bread specifically, it may have been, but it was probably more likely getting close to that season. And he uses this as an opportunity to talk about the relevance of leavening and the symbolism of the Passover lamb and unleavened bread. And he says in verse 6, we've read it a million times, but I think it's appropriate to read it again. It says in verse 6 of 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, it says, your glorying, other translations use the word boasting, their haughtiness, is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And so Paul, he says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And like the method we just talked about, just a little bit from the leaven starter dough, the previous batch passes from loaf to loaf, day in and day out, and it doesn't take much. However, it's impossible to do physically during the days of unleavened bread if you follow the Scriptures and you remove all the leavening. There is no starter left. There is no way to pass the old onto the new. But Paul's not actually talking about literal bread. He's using that as an example. He's talking about them. Individual people. This new group of people, the Corinthian believers. And as they approached the festival, he was using the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread to instruct them how it commemorates a new beginning in the life for those believers, a new reality in Christ Jesus. And he calls them unleavened, even though they were not living unleavened. Why? Simple. Because Christ, the Passover, had been sacrificed. And he was declaring those who accepted that Passover sacrifice were a new lump. A lump that was free from the old leavening within the lump of the old. In this, you could say, he is warning them not to be like the children of Israel in the Exodus story and turning their hearts back to Egypt. So I want to talk a little bit about this contrast that he uses between old and new. He says the old leaven is like the leaven of malice and wickedness. And this Greek word malice is kakia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, most likely not. But it simply means a cursory definition, look up in a concordance, just evil or wickedness. But if you do a little deeper dive, I come to realize that the way it's used is describing the internal drive or disposition a person can have within the heart that is characterized by an ill will or a desire to bring harm, which we know is the heart, the epicenter of one's intentions. Just like Jesus said in Matthew the 15th chapter, where he talks about out of the heart comes evil and all different kinds of evil. Murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. Those are the things that Jesus mentions out of the heart comes in Matthew the 15th chapter. But the interesting part about the context of how Paul brings out this word, and it's kind of similar. I mean, we have our own English word, malicious, malice, malicious. It has similarities. But the thing about malice and the way it's described, it's a very internal thing. It's the driving force. Some people have actually separated the two meanings, that malice is the intent, the epicenter of where the wickedness is the outpouring, the physical following through of what began in the heart, the malice in the heart. But it's used in contrast to old malice and wickedness with new sincerity and truth. And when we say, I think it's interesting, when we say someone is sincere, we use that word in our English language, we oftentimes are saying that someone who's sincere, that their words, their actions, their intents, their intentions of the heart are all consistently aligned. If someone says to you, God bless you, I hope you have a good day, or I'm really hoping that you get that job promotion, but they don't really mean it, they're insincere. What they say, what they do, isn't aligned with how they really feel. They're insincere. They are not authentic in what they are trying to portray. And I think that in this case, that's what Paul is getting at. That this group of people are claiming one thing, but they're living out their lives in an inconsistent way with what they're claiming. Their toleration of sin, their toleration of this inappropriate relationship. And it's talking about someone that's being, quite frankly, a hypocrite. And it's interesting, and I want to just bring this out. because Peter uses the same word in 1 Peter 2, verse 16. Put all malice, kakia, and deceit and hypocrisy and evil and envy and all slander. And notice how he uses this word, kakia, linking it with deceit and hypocrisy. And here again, something just like Paul, in a different way, says one must rid themselves or lay aside or get away, to put away. The old leaven of malice and wickedness is characteristic of the old Egypt in the heart. The concept of old and new, it's not limited to this days of unleavened bread. Paul talks about this in other places, which I want to quickly go to in Ephesians, the 4th chapter. Ephesians 4, verses 17. He says this in verse 17. He says, "This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God, being of the ignorance that is in them, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling had given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness." And this is how Paul describes in his letter to the Ephesians the characteristics of something else he calls old, the old man. And of course, these individuals in Ephesus, living in the Roman Greco world, decadent and immoral behavior was all around them. And it's something that they once themselves participated in. Now, living in our modern culture, we know that we see all types of immoral behavior. We see the evil intentions of men and women, of humans. We see the carrying out of wickedness all around us. We see the discarding of truth all the time. And we live in this world, and we have no shortage of immoral behavior, even though it's been transformed into modern versions, and some people feel like because of that it's maybe more tolerable. But of course it's not. Paul refers to their walk, their mode of conduct here in Ephesians, and he uses the same word, the futility of their mind. It's a Greek word. It's the same word that's used all throughout Ecclesiastes. Now that's the Septuagint version of Ecclesiastes. And this word, maybe we've read Ecclesiastes many times before, vanities of vanities, essentially talking about the purposelessness of life's pursuits without God. No matter what you do, no matter all the wealth that you accumulate, no matter all the things that you do in this life, it is purposeless. It's futile apart from God. And he describes these individuals as having a complete insensitivity or an inability to feel. And I've given a message on this before, but I was learning some new things. The New King James Version has kind of an odd rendering of this one time that this phrase is used in the New Testament, as in Ephesians. It says, "who being past feeling." That's the only time in the entire New Testament, but the ESV and the Net Bible, the New English Translation Bible, it uses the phrase or renders this, they are calloused. They are calloused. And I've talked about this before. We all know what calluses are. Calluses are thickening of the skin that build up from repeated friction. And it's a defense mechanism. You talk to doctors, you look it up medically. It's a defense mechanism that takes place to help protect whenever you are rubbing against something. Most people get them on their hands. If you are in manual labor and you use tools, and you probably have calluses, or you lift weights, you probably have calluses on your hands. But the thing about calluses is it thickens and it becomes insensitive. You can't feel it. There's no feeling in it. And that's what Paul's saying, that they've become calloused. Their conscience have been calloused to all unrighteousness, to unholiness. They've become desensitized to sin. Despite that happening, and you can use a physical example of this, and I'll use one. I have an uncle that, despite not being able to feel danger, doesn't mean it's not dangerous. And what Paul's describing here is a very dangerous state of mind to be in for a myriad of reasons, but especially spiritually. I had an uncle a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago. He has neuropathy in his feet from diabetes and things like that. And he went down to Mexico and he was on a beach that was very hot. Mexico, we get 100-degree plus weather here in Oklahoma. We can just imagine what it's like in Mexico. And he's walking across a beach in scalding hot sand. Never knew it. Under his feet, burning the flesh. I'm not trying to get too graphical on you, but he didn't feel what was bringing him great harm. And he almost lost a foot over it and had lots of issues because of it. So I just wanted to bring that out, that despite this, despite becoming past feeling calloused, does not remove them from the danger, and especially spiritually. I want to kind of bring out a textual note here. And this textual note that I want to bring out is how Paul refers to the Ephesians. He actually, if you read the King James Version, it says, you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles do. As the rest of the Gentiles walk. Now, this rendering would imply that Paul was associating these Ephesian recipients of this letter as still being Gentiles. We know that many of them were literally still Gentiles, but the more older manuscripts that we have, like that's based on the ESV and some of the other translations, omits this word rest. For example, the ESV says that you must no longer walk as Gentiles do. What this means is that Paul, even though they are Gentiles, no longer sees them as such. He no longer views them, just like he no longer views the Corinthian church as being leavened, but they were unleavened. Another way of putting this, they are no longer residents of Egypt. Just like me and you are no longer residents of Egypt, but are free. And they were to walk not as residents of Egypt, but as people who had shackles of sin broken. I'm going to skip down to verse 20. We're going to wrap it up here. I know I'm kind of going late. Verse 20 of Ephesians, the 4th chapter. This is what Paul says after this. He says, but you have not so learned Christ, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that you put off concerning your former conduct the old man which grows corrupt according to deceitful lust, and be, verse 23, an important passage in this string of passages, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. The new man, just like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, is associated with the new unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Something I want to bring out is that this Greek verb in verse 23, is a Greek word that is be renewed in the spirit of your mind. It's a Greek verb that's in the present tense, which indicates it's a continuous and ongoing renewal, not just a one-time event. It is something that we do daily. We're not just to put off the old man during the days of unleavened bread. We're to put on the new man and off the old man daily. This festival, it's something that happens for 7 days, but it is indicative of what we've been called to do day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, and year out. Every single day of our life. I want to leave us with just one more string of passages because I think that it's important for us to understand that Paul didn't say, as I mentioned, he didn't say, put off the old man alone and leave it there. He didn't say that you were just, put away the old leaven of malice and wickedness. We replace it with the new. Another place that Paul talks about this concept of old and new being associated with sin, old being associated with sin and new being associated with righteousness, is in Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 17. He talks about the old man, and a lot of the things that he has to say in Colossians, the 3rd chapter, is reminiscent of what he says to the Ephesians in Ephesians 4. But he says this afterwards, and I wanted to bring out, we've talked about the characteristics of the old man. Let's talk about the characteristics of the new man, the new person. Verse 12 of Colossians 3, it says, "Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him." I must admit, there are days and times that I do not practice these characteristics of this new man that Paul talks about. I don't always show kindness. I don't always show people the patience and long-suffering that I should. I don't always let the peace of Christ rule in my heart. And I suspect you may feel the same way yourself. But today we have an opportunity on this 7th day of the days of unleavened bread. It comes and goes quick, doesn't it? And we have this physical reminder that we practice every day during this time of year to remind us what this is all about. And this bread of affliction, but really this reality that this is who we are because of Christ. We might not always live like it, but He's declared us unleavened. And Paul's telling the Corinthians, and he's telling the Scriptures are clear that you're unleavened. You need to put away the leavening of malice and wickedness. You've got to be consistent with who you really are. Now, that doesn't mean that we can sin no matter what, we're going to be unleavened, but a true person that's filled with God's Spirit is going to be repentful, is going to come back, is going to turn back to God and recognize that they need to repent. We have an opportunity to be renewed in our spirit, as Paul said, present tense verb that means something continually that we do. To choose the new over the old, not just during this time of year, but daily. And remember, as human beings living in this carnal flesh that we live in, this fallen flesh that we have, this physical body that sometimes succumbs to the carnality that we are to put to death daily as we have been crucified with Jesus and we've went into a watery grave and we've come up a new person. We got to remember that Egypt will always be calling as long as we're living, but it never mentions the chains.